Good morning. My name is Naveen Adusumilli. I'm an extension economist with the LSU Ag Center. And this morning, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about financial principles and how some of these financial principles can be used to evaluate conservation practices on your farm. And I'll focus slightly more on the water conservation practices. So the learning outcomes of this module would be participants will understand what are the components of the financial analysis and how these financial principles will be useful to evaluate irrigation practices. And as I said, you can use these financial principles to evaluate any of the new conservation practices that a farmer adopts on his or her farm. Um, the participants will also understand what are the market forces and the resource factors that would be influencing some of the decision making on the farm, particularly with respect to irrigation. To begin with, why do we need a financial evaluation? One, financial evaluation is a key to improve adoption of some of these management practices because it would allow comparing the costs of those investments against the future financial benefits of that particular practice. The financial indicator that I would be focusing more today is called the net present value, NPV in short. And the simple definition of an NPV is net gain in wealth from an investment. It is calculated as present value of your cash inflows minus your investment cost of that practice. A simple decision rule for NPV is if net present value is positive, the project is expected to add value to your enterprise, and if it's negative, it's not adding value to the enterprise. As a result, if NPV is positive, you consider that project, and if NPV is not positive, you look for other alternatives. So, there are few key steps in estimating net present value calculation. The first two key steps are one needs to understand how to calculate gross revenue. Gross revenue is nothing but multiplying your total harvest on your farm times the unit price of that particular product, which would give the gross revenue. So for example, if you're growing soybeans on your farm, you take the total harvest and multiply times the unit price of the beans, which would give you gross revenue. Step 2 would be to estimate gross margin. And gross margin is equal to the difference between gross revenue and your total cost on your farm. So for example, when you calculate gross revenue from step 1, you subtract the total variable cost that you identify on your farm, which would give gross margin. So those are the two key steps, and the first two key steps in estimating net present value. So what are the major items of cost? So when we talk about variable cost on the previous slide, these costs are those that change with the size of the enterprise. For example, land preparation cost, your input costs such as seeds, fertilizers, chemicals, labor, as well as the energy cost. Energy cost are the fuel cost that you spend for all the above practices. And the variable cost also includes the interest that you pay on the agricultural loans that you have taken for some of these practices, as well as the marketing cost also are included in the variable cost. In order to estimate the gross margin or the gross revenue that we identified earlier, we would need information on the crop prices as well as on the energy prices, and the information for both crop prices and energy prices can come from different sources. For example, USDA, Food and Policy Research Institute would release these annual projections which one could use to identify the crop prices, or we can also use the price information that we find in our local markets. Another source is Energy Information Administration, which would release these weekly updates on the fuel price that we could also use to estimate the gross margins that we have said would be one of the key steps in the NPV calculation. Another source of information that one would find very useful is the crop budgets that are annually released by LSEIX Center. The crop budgets would be a good starting point for one to identify the different components of the gross margin calculation, and it also provides an option to adjust according to your particular enterprise using the information that is already included in the crop budgets. So these are the two different sources that one could use to estimate your total variable cost, and the gross margin that we said would be an important component of the net present value calculation. Then comes the aspect of the investment analysis, or I'll also indicate this as time value of money. So what is the objective of this investment analysis? This is a process where we compare the overall returns on your farm with the practice situation to the without practice. So with practice and without practice here refers to the new conservation practice or the irrigation practice that one would adopt, and comparing the returns with the practice situation and without the practice situation. So that is what the objective of investment analysis is. And the reason I say here that it is, I can also refer to this as time value of money. So what does this time period analysis involve? There are three key steps, I would say. One, it would involve determining a discount rate. I will talk about the discount rate in my next slide in detail. And the analysis would also involve making an assumption regarding the practice. So for example, if one would purchase a surge valve and wanted to use that surge valve in his or her production enterprise, there is an assumption that one needs to make regarding the number of years that surge valve would be used on that farm. So for example, if we buy surge valve in this year, we need to make an assumption that we would use that surge valve for the next few years, be it 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. So that analysis would allow us to estimate the future returns that would be obtained on that farm and enable us to make a comparison of the investment cost to the present and the future returns from that particular practice. So that's the premise of the time period analysis. So as I said, I'll speak in detail about the discount rate and discounting. So what is this discount rate? This is a factor that is used to convert the future income or the future returns to the present income or present returns. And the reason that that conversion is important, because when going back to our surge valve example, if we purchase surge valve now, we are paying for that surge valve today. And if we are making an assumption that we would use that surge valve for the next coming 5 years, and there are returns associated with that enterprise for the next 5 years, we want to make a comparison of the current cost that we actually paid for the surge valve, which is today, to the returns that we are getting in this year as well as the future years. So the optimal way to make that comparison is to convert those future returns to today's value so that the comparison provides a reasonable estimate of the benefits versus cost. And that is why we use the factor which is called as discount rate to convert that future income into present income. And the estimates for this discount rate is provided by the US Office of Management and Budget, and it is updated annually, and one can access that information on the internet. And as I said, the whole process of converting that future income to present income is called as discounting. and that's what the last point on this slide refers to. So on this slide you can see the mathematical representation of net present value. I will walk you through this notation and you will quickly see that it is a very simple representation of your net return calculation. So to begin with, this B0 represents the benefits one would accrue in this particular year, or the year in which a practice is adopted. So going back to our surge valve example again, these are the benefits, the overall benefits on your farm after adopting the new practice, which is surge valve in this case. And number two, you subtract your total cost. Now this cost includes the additional cost that one has paid for that surge valve. So this particular representation here, which is B0 minus C0, is the total net returns in the year of adoption of the practice. Here in the next step, which is B1, that is the benefits that one accrues or one gets in the next year of adoption of the surge valve. So you remember when we talked about NPV would involve, or the time value of analysis would involve making an assumption regarding the number of years one would adopt a particular practice. So here I have hypothetically represented it as T number of years, and that T could be either 2, 3, 4, or 5. So here B1 represents the total returns in the following year of adopting that practice, which is surge valve in this case. And again, C1 is the total cost in year A1, or the following year of adoption of the surge valve. And here comes the process of discounting. Remember when we talked about the future returns should be converted to present value to make an optimal comparison of cost versus returns, and R here is the discount rate, which is that factor we use to convert the benefits and cost to the present values. And here we divide that by our discount rate, and the whole process is called as discounting. And here I wanted to briefly talk about what does that subscript mean. Remember, B2 is the benefits that we accrue in the following year, which is after B1, or the 2 years after adoption. C2 are the cost involved 2 years after adoption. And since we are converting those benefits and cost from the following second year to the current year, which is B0, that subscript 2 would help make that conversion. Quickly talking in brief about the previous slide. So net revenues, where we calculate benefits minus cost, they are accruing every year, and they are multiplied by the appropriate discount rate to give you the present value. And then the sum of all those present values is nothing but net present value. And if you remember, the selection criteria is if net present value is positive, that particular investment is adding value to your enterprise, so we adopt that practice. If adoption of that particular practice is not adding value, in other words, if NPV is less than 0, you do not adopt that practice, or you look for other alternatives. So what are the learning outcomes? The financial analysis, as I said, would allow comparison of cost and the benefits of a production practice, and here we focused slightly more on the irrigation practices. And the financial analysis is useful toward making a decision whether additional investments, and remember in this case we were talking about surge valve, and there was an additional investment to purchase that surge valve, and whether those additional investments would improve the overall bottom line. That is, would they actually add value to your enterprise? So that was the learning outcome of understanding these financial principles in crop production. And this material finally was based upon the work through a grant that was provided by Southern SARE, and in collaboration with an RCS and Southern University. And finally, thank you for your time, and here is my contact information.